So I want to make a couple things clear just from the start, right? This is not the professional telling you how to do this right. Okay, this is a guy who's learning too. I did youth ministry for about 10 years, and this is my third year teaching in a classical school. Okay, so I have been diving headlong into classical education for a little bit longer than just those 3 years, though, because when I was a youth pastor in Junction City, Kansas, I was working part-time for Cloud County Community College, and I was a recruiter, and I went to a classical school in Topeka, Kansas to recruit their kids to come to our community college. It was Cara Paravel Latin School, and I remember thinking to myself after meeting a couple of other students, they have no business going to our community college. They should be going somewhere much better than this. And I actually took a packet home with me that day to my wife. We had our first child at that time. It was 2, and I said, we are going to classically educate our children. I don't know what that means yet, but we're going to do that. So, just to share with you that this is just all part of the journey that I'm on as well as you, and this isn't a top-down authority structure here. So, but here's what I want to do. I'm calling this classical method and Christian principles for Socratic discussion. So what I want to do is have kind of 3 methodological topics that I want to cover and pair with that kind of a Christian principle to go with it. Okay, so here's the first thing. What is Socratic discussion and what are its uses? That's going to be the classical method we're going to talk about. And the principle that's going to go with it is that we want to question people into truth. We don't want to question them into doubt. Okay? And I'm going to hash this out in just a minute. But the next thing we're going to talk about will be the classical method is the types of questions that we can ask and how we can tailor them to any discussion. And then the Christian principle that will accompany that is that all truth is God's truth, and we want to plunder the Egyptians, a phrase that I'm borrowing from Augustine. Then the third thing we will talk about is how Socratic discussions differ from Harkness discussions. I find that there's a lot of confusion, I think, on what's the relationship between these two things. And so although there's going to be a Harkness discussion you can go to later, and I definitely recommend it because I saw them do it last year, I'm not going to get into all the details, but I do want to delineate what's the difference between Socratic and that. And then the Christian principle is that we want to teach students to ask good questions in all of life, just like Jesus did. Okay. So number 1, so what is Socratic discussion and what are its uses? So since this is a talk on Socratic discussion, I'm going to ask you, what do you think the purpose of a Socratic discussion is? What are we trying to accomplish by doing Socratic discussion? Feel free to raise your hand, or I'll just call on you randomly.
You want students to derive the answer on their own.
Okay, good. So when you say that you want students to derive the answer on their own, in contrast to what? What's the opposite side of that?
Rather than just giving them the information.
Okay. And what does something else like when we are through questioning, asking people, we have a truth in mind that we're trying to bring them to. What does that do for the student when they come to apprehend this truth? What does that create within them? Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
A feeling of accomplishment, enlightenment, learning that they did on their own. Good.
It's a very different kind of learning. It's not just this top-down didactic approach where here I am, again, the authority that has all the answers, and you write down everything I say, and then this will be on the test later, But it is, we are affirming that there is truth to be discovered, right? And by asking questions, you are going to come and realize and apprehend that truth for yourself. It's if Socratic discussion is done right and done well, then students will feel that they have discovered something that nobody really told them. It came to them by their own hard work. Okay. So I want to offer this idea that Socratic discussion has 2 main applications. One is deconstructive, and the other is constructive. So the deconstructive model, this is you see Socrates himself doing this all the time. Okay, great. How many of y'all have read Plato's Republic? Had a chance to do that? Okay, If you haven't, it's okay, but you should, right? Okay, this is one of the cornerstone books for the ancient world of classical education. In book 1 of Plato's Republic, it starts off very kind of casually. He's walking along somewhere, and then his friends catch up to him and say, "Hey, come hang out with us, and let's have a talk. We're going to go see some festivities later," And they start having this conversation about justice. What is justice? And so he allows them to toss out some different definitions. So you got Polemarchus, right? Polemarchus, he says, well, what if justice is telling the truth and returning to others what you owe them? That's this kind of first definition of justice, right? So what does Socrates do? He starts asking questions. He says, well, let's say that a friend lends you a weapon. So we hold this weapon for me, and then you have a debt to him now that you owe it to him to give it back to him when he asks for it back. So according to this definition of justice, you should give back what is owed to those you owe it. Well, but Socrates says, what if your friend comes to you and he's out of his mind and he demands that he have his weapon back? Is it just to give it to him? Okay. So through a series of questions in this conversation that I'm abbreviating here, right? It comes, well, there might be some problems with this theory of justice, that it's just giving back whatever is owed without any kind of condition, right? So Polemarchus says, well, I've got it, because that would be harmful to your friend to give him his weapon when he's out of his mind. So justice is doing good to friends and doing harm to enemies. Okay, interesting. Well, let me ask you this question. Do just men ever make bad men worse? And so he walks through this whole series of questioning, right, where he says, if you have a horse and you beat the horse, does this make the horse actually better in doing its job? Right? No, it actually harms the horse, right? So justice never actually causes harm to even bad men, because it just makes them worse, right? And so he walks them through this question and answer, and again, I'm just telling this to you, but he's having them do all the work of answering the questions, right? But what he's doing is he's deconstructing through questions bad ideas. So this goes on, and eventually you get to his name's falling out of my head, but you get to another guy who says, hey, you know what? Justice is just the benefit of the strong. Whoever's strongest might makes right, And he just goes through questions, and he deconstructs these different ideas. But what I want you to note is that in the process, Socrates allows those whom he's questioning to backpedal and try again. And I think that's a really important point. Okay, so whether you're taking an issue, a topic like what is justice, or you're reading through Lord of the Rings and you're considering a passage in Lord of the Rings and whether or not it was right of Frodo not to share the ring with Sam, who offers to take that burden for him. Whatever your situation may be, you want to allow students to say, well, this is what I think, and this is why I think it. And you can question if you think there's a flaw in what they're saying, go ahead and begin to start applying the questions that kind of draw out that flaw. But then when they see the problem, allow them to switch gears and try again. Don't jump into, here's what you should have said, right? Like, allow them to take a step back and take a second run at it. But it's really, this process of questioning to deconstruct bad ideas is a major part of what you see Socrates doing all throughout the Platonic dialogues. But the one thing that I want to push back against, and this is kind of where the Christian principle comes in, Socrates has a habit of deconstructing ideas, bad ideas, and leaving people in the ash heap of their bad ideas, right? And while there's a certain level that can be appropriate because people need to kind of come full force, full face with, wow, my worldview just led me to a hole, right? What I want to argue, though, is that as Christians, we have the responsibility to rebuild what we deconstruct. The other thing that I want to point out here is that Socrates is very clear that he always stays on topic. So even though Socrates allows people to backpedal, they can say, oh, yeah, that definition of justice, man, that didn't work very well. What about this definition of justice? That's great. What we don't want to do is have rabbit trails. What we don't want to do is say, that whole justice conversation, that makes me think of this topic over here about beauty, Well, if you can kind of hook it in and directly relate it to the topic, you can give a little leeway, right? But for the most part, we need to stay on topic. We need to make sure that we don't allow students to get too far off track, because one of the things that we need to be committed to in this is being clear in our own mind about the objective that we are trying to teach, the concept that we are trying to bring across to students. And so we cannot allow too many rabbit trails off track. One of the other things that's very helpful, this is just a real practical tip, is that Socrates uses a technique that you could call either-or questioning, which is to say that it's good and appropriate to have very open-ended questions to see where they will go sometimes. But if you want to lead somebody towards something, either-or questions can be very useful. So let me give you an example of that. Who wants to do a little role play with me? Anybody willing to step up? Okay, very good. So let's imagine for a minute that you are a young man in my classroom who has said, Mr. Allee, I'm just not convinced that it makes sense that God could be omnipresent. I can't be here and somewhere else, so how could God be here and somewhere else at the same time, right? So I might ask you, does God have a body like you and I?
Jesus did.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's very good. But when we talk about God, we have the incarnation of Jesus, right? But does Jesus have a divine nature and a human nature?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So when we're talking about God, we're typically talking about just the divine nature for this moment. So when we talk about the divine nature of God, does God have a body or does he not have a body?
He does not have a body.
He does not have a body. Right, right. In fact, John 4:24 says God is a spirit, and we must worship him in spirit truth. Since God does not have a body, does he extend into space, or does he not have a need of space to extend into?
Could you say that again?
Yeah. Since God does not have a body, he's not material, there's not any physicality to him, does he extend into space, or does he not even need space to extend into?
He's outside of it, but yet he drives it.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, he's not a part of matter, but he's outside of it. It's almost like it exists beyond, as a part of his desire or will. He makes it occur, but he's not part of that.
Right, right.
He's outside of it.
Okay. But would you say that he's also immanently present in the world, even though he is not part of the material world?
Yes, he is, because he said that I am. That means that he's constant.
Okay.
He's always present.
Very good, very good. So I think then you would agree with me that God, although he is present in the world, he doesn't need space to extend into because he's not a physical object. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So if God is not spatially located, that is to say that he's not here instead of there because he's a physical object taking up space, right? If God is not spatially located in one place, is it possible that God is God is located by an act of will or mind wherever he focuses his mind? What do you think about that idea? Let me back up and clarify that a little bit. Okay, have you ever heard of the old question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin?
No, I've never.
You've never heard that?
No.
Okay.
1,300. That's the exact answer that came up.
Well, good. This guy's on top of it. So Dorothy Sayers in her Lost Tools of Learning actually kind of makes a reference to this. But part of the reason that this was such an interesting discussion, right, is because you had angels who are not omnipresent beings like God, and yet they're not material beings either. So they don't seem to extend into space or take up space. So how many could fit on the top of the head of a pin, right? And it becomes a good rhetoric discussion, basically, to try to work that kind of concept out. Well, what I'm trying to get into is one way to think about it is that immaterial beings can be present in the same sense that my mind can be present in the hallway as I look out into the hallway, right? God, as an omniscient being, can be present by presence of mind in the same way in all places. So the question that I would ask then is, if God is present wherever he is by presence of mind and not by spatial location, is it difficult for an omnipotent, omniscient being to be present everywhere at once?
As far as difficult being laborious or hard, it would be no, because there's no sense of him being able to move things. He's outside of it. As far as being in one place to another, that is still a hard ideal for me as a person, being limited to have the imagination or capacity to be able to hear and see and understand and perceive all things at one time. That'd be difficult. So, but within that reference, to answer yes, God, I believe God can do those things.
Right.
But for me to actually understand that at a meaningful level is
Yeah.
difficult.
And see, the fun thing is that this could lead off into future conversations about God in relationship to time, and God in relation to all kinds of wonderful things we could do, right? And the fun part is when you start doing a Socratic discussion with somebody who's clearly done this kind of thing before, right? He can push back harder than the students typically do, but it's good. No, it's really good. It's really good.
What do my ninth graders say?
Yeah.
Is it Chicken Strip Wednesday?
But the main point that I am trying to get at is that through kind of either or questioning, you can allow the conversation to be guided a certain direction. So because open-ended questions can kind of go anywhere, right? But either or questions will allow students to make a pathway decision. And usually if those can be phrased in such a way that honestly it's a little more clear that this is the right way to go. Here they are still engaging in the process of discovery. I made that decision, right? I came to that conclusion myself, and yet they're going down the road that you'd like for them to go. All right, so that's the deconstructive method again is undermining views. In logic, we could call that reductio ad absurdum, right, which is just getting into the driver's seat of an idea and reducing it to its absurd conclusion. So whenever you are onto something that's being argued, that you know that if you get into that argument and you just let it go where it really naturally wants to go, it's going to lead you to a place that nobody wants to be, right? That's how you can kind of begin to ask these deconstructive questions to allow the student to see where their idea goes. But on the constructive side of that, again, we want to be able to build something in its place. So, in order to do this effectively, I think there's at least two things that we need to have. First, we need to know the lesson that we are trying to teach. And this is just the law of the lesson. I mean, this is 7 laws kind of stuff, right? It's pretty basic, but that's to say we must be very clear on the conception or the truth that we are trying to communicate to our students. So if we are Socratically going to lead people to the right conception of justice or beauty or whatever it may be, we must be very clear in our own mind what that means. Depending on the topic we're dealing with, this may require a lot of time and attention on our part. And it's one of those things that again, as I say, I'm a third-year classical teacher. There are certain topics that I'm still, obviously, just grasping to try to really understand and wrap my mind around. But I think we want to be careful about, I mean, stuff comes up in class whether you're looking for it or not, but when you are intentionally initiating a Socratic dialogue, right, you don't want to start down that road unless you're pretty sure you have a clear conception of what you're doing. The good thing about the deconstructive method of Socratic discussion is that even when a new idea comes your way, you can start asking questions to see whether or not it follows, right? Whether it's a non sequitur or whether it's, no, this actually makes some sense, right? But if you have a planned out Socratic discussion, I recommend not going down that road unless you have a clear conception already of what you want to teach these kids. So again, first we got to know the lesson that we're trying to teach, law of the lesson. Second, we must know the content of or subject or discussion on kind of a mastery level. This is the law of the teacher. That is to say, we must have spent significant time thinking and preparing for the discussion. So the best Socratic discussions are not off the cuff. Now, I mean, sometimes you have some really cool things that happen Socratically in class because somebody brings something up and you just kind of go with it. But the best Socratic discussions are ones that you've spent a lot of time thinking about, a lot of times preparing for. This means being thoroughly familiar with either the topic or maybe the book that you're studying. You have actually read this passage before you're talking about it, you know. This means having pre-prepped questions for discussion. So again, I think it pays to have already laid out the kind of questions that you want to ask and where you want to go with this so that you're not just trying to think of questions on the fly. Now, it's obviously the case that depending on how the student responds to you, you may spontaneously have a question that you want to ask them, but I just don't recommend going into this without any preparation. The other thing that you want to do is to try to anticipate how you think your students might answer your question, right? And one way to do this is to kind of role play with your spouse or your friends and family, right? And say, well, how would you respond to this if I asked you this question? I strongly recommend after-action reviews also. You've had a Socratic discussion and you had your list of questions, and now you've asked your kids these questions and they have responded with things that you would have never dreamed of, right? You need to reflect on that. Why did they say that? Why did they go there? Why did they make that connection? Since they did respond this way, and I know I said this, but what would have been a better way for me to respond to that? You know, because this is going to happen again, probably. There's going to be second chance at this same kind of a conversation. And the other thing that's just really important is the ability to control the flow of a conversation. To be able to, again, not only keep things on topic, but to make sure that the dialogue is heading the right way. Here in a little bit, I'm going to talk about the relationship between Socratic and Harkness, but I'll just give you this much at this point. In a Socratic discussion, you know, the conversation should largely be like a tennis match between one teacher and the students. Okay, so it's going more like this, you know, but it's not going as much between the students and them. Somebody might disagree with me on this point, but this is my perspective on Socratic, because the reason is you have, as a teacher, an objective truth that you're trying to impart through Socratic questioning to the students, right? And which means that you have to be able to control and guide the course of the conversation. Harkness provides a whole different opportunity for things you can do with inter-student dialogue and questioning, but for the Socratic level, it's really important to keep control of the conversation. All right, so let's see here. Let's move on to sorry, my notes are in the line here. As far as, again, there's the Christian principle here is that we really do want to make sure that we do not leave kids lingering too long. I think it's entirely appropriate to throw out a question or to bring up a topic that the students, it's new to them or it's challenged their view, and to let it just kind of sit there on the table for a while, maybe even go home overnight and think about it, right? What I think is really dangerous, though, is when we undermine certain worldview issues without reaffirming a truth in its place. This is where, I think it's not hard to see that, for instance, there have been Christians who have held onto a certain, maybe secondary issue of Christian doctrine, but they've held it very dearly, right? And without giving examples, because I don't want to step on anybody's toes, that has, for them, been debunked, right? They've ran into a wall with somebody, and they feel like, wow, this thing that I held dearly is wrong. It's not true. I don't think Christianity is even true. You see what just happened, right? It's like, well, wait. You've jumped the gun, but nonetheless, something that was dear to you has been undermined, and you're just starting to question everything now. What can I even know? And so I want to make sure that we don't leave students in this place of doubt. If we're going to deconstruct an idea, going to deconstruct part of their worldview, we'd better be able to point them in the right direction at the same time. And so in 2 Corinthians 10:5, the scriptures tell us, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. So there is definitely scriptural principle here for us to deconstruct bad ideas, to take captive the world of ideas, right? But I would note that 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, which tells us all Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. This is kind of our injunction as well, to say we are a people of a received, of a revealed faith, right? So we have bedrock foundational truths from which to stand on. So we don't want to just take away people's beliefs. We want to reestablish better beliefs, better worldviews. All right. So let's move on to the next section, where the types of questions to ask and how we can tailor them to any conversation. One way to think about this is that just as we have grammar, logic, and rhetoric, we have grammar, logic, and rhetoric questions. Okay? So the grammar questions: who, what, where, when, how. Okay? Don't say why, because why is a logic question. Okay? You're been reading a text. You've been reading The Allegory of the Cave by Plato, and these questions are just to establish the facts, just what is going on. What is the setting? Well, there's this cave, right, and there's these people chained to a wall, right? Well, what do these people spend their time doing? Well, they spend their time looking at shadows in the wall and giving them names, okay? Because there's this light that's casting shadows on the wall, And you're just getting the details, the facts, the information. And then you can move to logic questions. These are the questions which examine the argument being made. So simply, what is the argument that this author is making? What is he trying to convey to you in this story? Identifying premises and conclusions. I think we want to. Just one thing I've observed from my very limited interaction with a number of schools. We have this logic stage, and we teach formal logic maybe in 7th and 8th grade. Some go into 9th grade, and I feel like a lot of times you get to the rhetoric level, and the kids go, "Oh, thank God we're done with that," and they just let's not do logic anymore, And I want to encourage that even on rhetoric level, we want to continue to ask students, how would you take this argument and make a syllogism out of it, How would you take this argument, right? Or if you're thinking propositional logic, how would you break this down and check it for consistency with this idea? We want to really encourage that to keep happening. So what is the argument being made by this author? Or if you're having a conversation on a topic, take the student's own argument and say, let's test that out. Let's see whether that can be true or consistent, or how would you put that into a syllogism. Then we want to check the premises. Are the premises of the arguments true? So if we're thinking of like a deductive syllogism, right? Well, how do you ever know ultimately whether a deductive syllogism is true? Well, okay, so you know that if the first premise and the second premise are true and the conclusion follows from the premises, that the conclusion is definitely true. But how do you know if the premises are true? This is where inductive logic comes into play, right? You start offering lines of reasoning or evidence to support one of these premises, right? So you can do that with students. You can say, okay, now that we've taken the argument and we've put it in kind of a deductive form, let's consider each premise and say, well, how would you offer some evidence for this premise? Okay? And then finally, you got to ask the question, is the argument sound? Do you think that the argument actually obtains its purpose? Are you convinced? Do you find it cogent? Would you, based off of the arguments you've heard in the text or from maybe your fellow students, do you buy in, and why? So those are good kind of logic questions. Rhetoric questions. These are the questions which consider the way an idea is being or should be conveyed. Does the author primarily make his appeal through logos, ethos, or pathos? So is this first and foremost a logical argument that he's making, a very technical, or is he appealing to maybe our sense of duty and what is right and what ought to be done? Or is he appealing to what pulls at our heartstrings, that this just should move us? How is this information being delivered? We can consider the actual structure if it's of the presentation, whether it's following the 5 canons, or not, or how do we put it, or how could we put it into that way? How would you take the same message and repackage it if you were going to tell it to someone else? This is kind of what Selby was just talking about with the progymnasmata. Let's take the basic structure of the argument, or let's take the basic ideas of the argument, and how could you put it in a new light? How could you put it in a new way? So, for instance, if this was a extremely logical argument, right, how could you take the same concept, the same argument, and how could you argue for it using more pathos? So what if you wanted to just change the nature of the way it's being presented, but keep the same content, right? Well, let's see what the kids come up with. Then I would offer that we should ask Christian worldview questions, because we're not just classical schools, we're Christian classical schools, right? We want to bring our faith to bear on the issue. These are questions which bring the truth of Christianity to bear or to make judgments upon ideas or propositions. So is the main idea here in agreement with specific Christian principles? Something that's emphatically stated in Scripture? Is it complementary to Christianity, which means that it may not be explicitly stated in Scripture, but you could believe this and Christianity. There doesn't seem to be any problem with that idea, right? Or is this something that's completely contrary to our Christian worldview, something that should be rejected fundamentally? How should we as Christians respond to this idea of it? Should we accept it? Should we be indifferent to it? Should we reject it? There are, of course, application questions. There's the thing I want to say about application questions. People usually start with those. Don't, right? Application, this is good, typical evangelical Bible study, right? What does this mean to you? Don't start there. It's not a horrible question in itself, right? But I don't care what it means to you or how you're going to apply it to your life until after you understand what it says, what argument's being made, why it's being made. So when we get to application questions, it's only in light of having kind of done all the other legwork first, of asking grammar, logic, and rhetoric type questions, and Christian worldview questions. But nonetheless, we do want to say, well, how should this affect us? Should this actually change the way I live my daily life, right? So back to Plato's allegory of the cave, he's trying to get at this idea that this world is actually just the shadow of the real thing, right? And you could even pull in passages like from Hebrews where it talks about the temple being just a shadow of the real thing, the real tabernacle in heaven where Christ went and made ultimately our atonement for us. And so you say, well, is it really the case that there is this world of real objects that are immaterial, but that this world is a copy of? And if it's really the case, right, how does that change how you live? How does that change how you look at mathematics? How does that change how you look at the idea of language when we're calling, when we're calling this red, okay, well, is this red in the same way that is red? Are they both participating in some sort of redness that's common to both but isn't actually wholly contained by either? Okay, that's an abstract thing, I know, for a lot of us, but the point is these ideas, they're big ideas, and how should that actually affect the way we think and live, right? Sorry, my dissertation gets into all that, so I get really excited about it. Everybody just looks at me like, oh my gosh. The other thing I want to say is I want to give you a couple of tools of I call them digging questions. These don't really fit in the category. They should be used through grammar, logic, rhetoric, all that kind of stuff, kind of questions. But they're just very simple questions to get deeper. And they're really, really easy. In fact, you can do this in any part of your life, learn a lot of things, and irritate people constantly. It's simple. What do you mean by that? You just said this thing. What do you mean by that? And you can tailor that to the specific issue. When you said this, what does that mean? The other question that you can ask is, how did you come to that conclusion? How did you come to that conclusion? What was the reasoning process that led you to think that way? One of the things that you get reading the Platonic dialogues and watching Socrates is he in some way, shape, or form, he does this a lot. And what people often end up admitting somewhere along the way, I don't know what I meant. I know that I said that thing, but I don't know what I mean by the thing that I just said. Okay? And so we want to push our kids to make sure that they know what they're actually saying and why they are actually saying those things, that they have a reason for it. I teach this to our kids in apologetics because constantly people make claims like, oh, science has disproved that there's a God. And I'm just like, I know that if I just start digging into that, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? In what way has science, demonstrated that there's no God? 9 times out of 10, people make slogan statements, right? They don't have a clue what they're saying. But we want our kids to be better than that. We want our kids to be better than just making like quips and slogan statements. We want our kids to make sure if I'm going to open my mouth and make a propositional claim, I should have reasons for why I think what I think, right? Otherwise, I should probably just be quiet. But they shouldn't be quiet because we want them to talk. There's always that kid that's willing to be quiet the entire time, right? And so the Christian principle that I want to go along with just these kinds of model questions is that we should be looking for truth everywhere. And we should expect that we can find truth almost anywhere. So obviously we have the revelation of Scripture, which is perfect truth, which is the safest place to go looking for truth. You can just kind of soak in that and not worry that you're going to receive something that you don't really want to take in, right? But even when you are reading the works of pagans, or even when you are talking to a staunch atheist, right? The thing is we live in a world that God made, like it or not, right? And people are discovering true things and saying true things even when a lot of their worldview might be messed up, okay? So I want us to go into these classical texts we read or conversations we have with people with different religious or worldview backgrounds than ourselves, knowing that by asking the right kind of questions, we should expect to find truth. But we also want to delineate the truth from the falsity, right? We want to be able to break down these bad ideas and leave the good ones still standing. And this is what Augustine of Hippo referred to as plundering the Egyptians. So I'll just read a quote from him real quick. He says, if those, however, who are called philosophers have said things with which are indeed true and are well accommodated to our faith, they should not be feared. Rather, what they have said should be taken from them as from unjust possessors and converted to our use. Just as the Egyptians had not only idols and grave burdens which the people of Israel detested and avoided, so also they had vases and ornaments of gold and silver and clothing which the Israelites took with them secretly when they fled, as if to put them to a better use. In the same way, all the teachings of the pagans contain not only simulated and superstitious imaginings and grave burdens of unnecessary labor, which each one of us leaving the society of pagans under the leadership of Christ ought to abominate and avoid, but they also contain liberal disciplines more suited to the use of truth, and some of the most useful precepts concerning morals. Even some truths concerning the worship of the one God are discovered among them. So I just appreciate this kind of, and we get this truth from Romans 1, that God has revealed himself in the things that he has made. And although the context of that is so that unbelievers are without excuse, right? It's not a real happy kind of passage. But it is nonetheless the case, right, in both Romans 1 and in 2, that God has revealed himself so that even people who don't know Christ know things about God. They know things that are true because God made a world that has truth in it. And Paul makes this point in Acts 17 as well, when he actually quotes from two different Greek pagan poets, right, making his point when he's at the Areopagus. And so it's interesting to me, and I like to point this out often, that Paul is familiar enough with Greek poetry to quote these guys. So although I'm an avid proponent of studying our Bibles more, right, I don't like the idea that, well, you can't read any of that pagan stuff, because it's just full of lies. Well, yeah, it's got a lot of problems, right? But it turns out that Paul used it for his basis of launching the gospel into Athens, right? Because they had actually mined out this truth that in him we live and move and have our being, right? He's like, see that thing you said? That's right. That idol to the unknown God, or that statue to the unknown God, right? Guess what? You're right. He's the only one, though. Okay, so let's affirm the good and the truth, and let's build on that and deconstruct the other ideas that are not so hot. All right, I want to move on to, so how is Socratic discussion different from Harkness discussion? Socratic discussions are driven by the instructor. Dialogue, again, is this bouncing back and forth like this. Okay, so I'm on a 1-on-20 tennis match, right? And but it always comes back to me, which allows me to direct the conversation the way that I want it to go. Harkness gives a topic to the students, which they should study and prepare for beforehand. Each student then should use a mix of sharing their views on the matter and employing the Socratic questioning techniques to expose flaws in other students' view. Ideally, students should be willing to abandon their own view if they find out that one of the other students is more correct than they are. So one of the things that, I don't know how much you've done of looking at Harkness discussions. The beginning of Harkness comes from a place where they actually are kind of more wishy-washy about truth. I don't know if you're familiar with the background of where Harkness developed. But we need to move this into our Christian context, okay? So in Harkness discussions, in a lot of colleges that use them, that are secular colleges, it's kind of like, let's all just have this conversation and we can learn from one another, but where we end up, it doesn't really matter as long as we had a great conversation, right? I want to make sure that we're really affirming truth exists. It's objective, it's real. If you're not in line with it, you're wrong, And so, although Harkness discussions allow for students, and allow for this conversation to kind of go a lot of different directions, it could go a lot of places, what we have to affirm constantly is that there is actually a truth to be had in this issue. It could be that a Harkness discussion happens, and nobody actually grabs the truth in that. Okay, so in a Socratic discussion, obviously this is why I say you have to have the truth clearly conceived to bring it to the students, but in a hardness discussion, it could be that the students kind of miss the mark, and you may have to have some after-action discussions after that's kind of completed, because we don't want to leave, oh, yeah, Johnny, he had the best idea of all this, and it's like, yeah, great, Johnny's teaching Mormon theology right now, though, we don't want to leave that just there, so we may have to come up and do some cleanup duty, but as a Socratic discussion, where there's a definite lesson to be learned, hardness discussions, they really can go many different directions, but the role of the leader is to keep this there's a boundary line we're trying to keep the discussion in, okay? So whereas in Socratic, I'm very driven and focused, making sure this goes the direction I want it to. In a hardness discussion, I'm actually letting the kids do most of the work. Hopefully what they have done as they've come up through logic school and had a lot of Socratic discussions, they've learned how to ask the right kind of Socratic questions. They've learned how to pursue truth for themselves. And now hardness is the time to let them do it, to kind of get out of the way, right? So your role in this case then is just to be like, okay, Johnny, that was awesome, but it's a little off topic, so even though I think you had a good idea, let's go back this way. Okay, now, Emily, go ahead and pick up where you left off, because I think you really had something to say. Go ahead and go. So you're just kind of keeping it in bounds, but again, you're letting them do their thing. Socratic discussion, it allows us as teachers to model the process of getting to truth through questioning. But hardness discussions are the students' chance to use what they have learned through Socratic instruction. So in my opinion, and this may be, again, something that pedagogically some might disagree with, but in my opinion, we should be very heavily Socratic-centered in the logic stage. And about the time we get to 10th and especially 11th and 12th grade, we should be doing a lot more hardness. We should be doing a lot more letting the students drive the conversation. Because if we've done our job right on the Socratic level, we've given them the tools they need to pursue truth together. And hardness also has the benefit of allowing students to learn how to actually dialogue back and forth with arguing for truth, but not getting angry, right? So being able to make their case and to counter somebody else's view, it's a great opportunity for them to do that in a kind of a lab setting where you can still kind of every once in a while, whoa, hey, let's be a little less passionate about it. You're all pathos and no logos. Let's just draw back a little bit here and make an argument. But the Christian principle, I think, in Socratic and hardness discussions is, again, just this pursuit of objective truth. That there is truth, that it exists independent from us. Truth is what corresponds to reality, the way things actually are. And so whether as the Socratic leader, I am driving the conversation and I'm trying to formulate an idea in the mind of students that they're going to discover for themselves, and I didn't do it to them, right? But in hardness, it's the same thing. If you're discussing whether or not the American citizenry should have guns or not, right? There's going to be really polar views on that, and we may not ever get agreement on that, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not a truth, right? It doesn't mean there's not something to be actually more approaching correctness or falling away from it. So, and I want to just note that this is the method that Jesus uses constantly. Have you ever noticed what Jesus does like 9 times out of 10 when the Pharisees or Sadducees or scribes ask him a question? He asks them a better question, right? Hey, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Well, okay, here's the trapping, right? If Jesus says, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, great, we get him in trouble with Caesar. If he says, yes, you should, well, all the Jews are going to be upset. Well, all right, you're not really loyal to our people, right? But here you go. He says, instead, whose image is on this coin, right? Just turns the whole conversation over. All right. I think I am out of time. So any quick questions that anybody wanted to ask before I let you go?
So I'm trying to figure out what what's appropriate for what level of progressive students as they develop. Ninth grade, you suggested, was a Socratic method where the teacher leads. 11th and 12th. How do you know when a ninth grader, the level, is ready to move on into where the students kind of set the boundary? How do you get a sense for that?
I think probably part of the difficulty on that, and this may be like per school, their policies about when the cutoff is for accepting students into the class. I mean, if you're accepting new students, like 11th grade, which we do sometimes, I'm not saying we don't, right? You're going to have some students that are obviously going to be drowning in the scenario. I guess what I would recommend is even on the level where you're doing more Harkness, to still have like kind of brief Socratic workshops, like at the beginning of the year, like at least to say, you know, these are the principles, this is how to do it. And I think it's okay also to, especially earlier in the year when you're just starting to do some Harkness with them, to say this Harkness discussion is going to be one that I'm going to step into and point some things out at different times until everybody kind of gets the flow of it. But you know, I think ideally, the ideal situation, which never happens, right, is that, you know, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, I mean, they have gotten so used to you as the teacher Socratically questioning them that they have learned the process. They have learned how to ask good questions, what are the right kinds of questions, what kind of questions get towards better information, towards truth. And so then when you get to 10th, 11th, 12th grade, and you start doing this Harkness, you're just saying, okay, you know that thing that I've been doing to you the last 3 years, right? Now it's your chance to do it to each other, which is fun, you know. And so I think, you know, our job at that Harkness level is just to be the moderator that steps in when need be, but for the most part allows them to just do what they've had modeled for them for the last several years. If that makes sense.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm so new to this, and my level is definitely much younger, but still doable. How do you encourage them to continue after you've helped them identify, I guess, their flaw in the argument? They've come to that point, okay, I'm not right. How do you, and instead of them like shutting down or just not, how do you keep encouraging the conversation so that they do get to that point of self-discovery?
Yeah. So if you've got a kid at a point where they have clearly come to realize my idea has just fallen apart, you know, my point of view has just fallen apart, I would ask them a leading question now that starts going the other direction. So again, you have the clear concept in your mind of what you're trying to teach, right? So you're going to now ask them, well, it's okay that, you know, you maybe realize that your first idea didn't work out, but what do you think about this idea? How would you respond to X, you know? So that way you're inviting them to still participate in the conversation, and you're kind of throwing them a bone, right? Again, in apologetics, I do this sometimes. I do this sometimes with atheists they'll make a claim, I'll debunk it, and they're kind of like, oh, I don't know what to say now. I'm like, well, maybe you meant to say this. I try to give them something to help them not feel silly, because we're not trying to just make people feel dumb, you know. But there's this kind of point where people have to realize that there are bad ideas out there, you know. Despite the famous saying, there are no stupid questions. There are. But it's okay to ask them, you know, and it's okay to move beyond that. And so, does that make sense? Is that helpful? Okay. All right.
I find that the more success, just as an observation, I find the more success I have, the more knowledge I have. I teach, you know, literature. The more knowledge I have about it, the more successful I am in this. So the key is mastery.
Yeah.
In doing this, it's you know, Animal Farm, got it all day long. Dragging the race.
Yeah, and it really is. I mean, you know, practice makes perfect. The more you do this, the easier it becomes. You'll have days that are awesome and days you're like, I just totally messed that entire conversation up, you know, and it'll be okay. All right, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.